because it's not yet started here.
Yeah, don't go live yet, Ashish. Once we
Yeah.
begin, then I think you go.
We just I think we just want to keep it ready.
Yeah.
So that we don't. We can...
So we can begin. We can begin now.
I think
Huh?
Jagannath
Ashish?
is. Yeah, we can. Jagannath is in the waiting room. Can you admit him?
Okay. Okay. So okay, Ruby, let's begin. Over to you.
Yeah. Should we start?
Yeah, we can start, Ruby. We can start.
Okay, welcome everyone to the very first installment of the TICI, the Tribal Intellectual Collective lecture series. And it's only befitting that we have Dr. Virginius Kaka as the inaugural speaker. For the uninitiated, Dr. Kaka has over 42 years of teaching experience, starting off teaching sociology at the Northeastern Hill University, Nehru in 1978, then moving on to Delhi School of Economics, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and Tejpur University. He's held postdoctoral fellowships under the Indo-French Cultural Exchange Program at MHS Paris in 1982. He was a Commonwealth Academic Staff Fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London in 1988, and a Fulbright Fellow at the University of California, Santa Cruz, USA in 1998. A distinguished author of seminal works on sociological concerns of plantation laborers, tribes, agrarian structure and development, and social exclusion, among others, we all know his works. He has also been on literary and editorial advisory boards of national and international journals, and has been a member of various committees of the Government of India and governing boards and advisory committees as well of various research institutes, universities, and NGOs. He is an Adivasi public intellectual and mentor to many. Today he explores a critical history of tribal studies of India. If any one of us were speaking on this topic, it would be incomplete without mentioning him. Dr. Kaka is indeed synonymous with tribal studies in India by tribals. I don't know how he'll position himself within this framework, but we'll learn soon enough. Professor Bodhi will respond to the lecture and he will moderate other responses if time permits after the talk. Dr. Kaka, now I invite you to address us. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for nice words. It's a pleasure to talk, let's say, to a tribal intellectual collective, which we had formed long ago, I think, if I'm not mistaken, around 2009. And since then, it has ups and downs, but nevertheless, it has been going on. My entry into the study of tribes has been by accident and not by choice. I grew in a plantation tea state, and therefore the engagement with labor and the questions of land and labor was deeply of interest to me. And therefore I primarily worked on the agrarian structure, the issue of land ownership, control and management, and also the question of the plantation labor. And since all these were very intricately connected with the issue of the capitalism, the development, I had also an interest on the issues of development, particularly in terms of its entanglement with the world social system. My interest, I just said that to tribal studies was just by accident, as I said, not by choice. And it all happened when I moved from Northeastern Delhi University, Shillong in 90 to Delhi School of Economics. And every time anything was happening about the tribal communities, invariably my colleagues will ask my opinion about that. And I always tell them that I don't know because I have not been working on the tribes and I've not really read much. And invariably they will tell me that you must know. And it is in that context that after so much of persuasions, I thought, let me just start reading. So I began reading, and as I began reading, I thought that much of what has been written on tribes, where something was very much agitating me, and therefore I decided to start my own journey on the study of tribes, and that is how it began. Today, I will talk about, the topic is the critical history of the tribal studies. And I'm not really going to define tribal studies, although I know that there are groups who have been trying to think as to how to conceptualize the tribal studies. Although there is some sense in that, but I tend to think at the moment, or I tend to look at the tribal studies at the moment in terms of wide range of work or wide range of thinking and ideas which are really being put, let's say, on the community which we call tribes. It is in that context that I'm really talking about the tribal studies. So it is not necessarily with a very particular, specific orientation that I'm really talking about tribal studies. Now, as we are trying to understand the history of tribal studies, I think it is important for us to understand the history of the category of the term tribe itself. In fact, the term tribe, the category of tribe itself has undergone history. Its root is primarily comes from the Latin word tribus. This was a kind of, let's say, a social organization with the voting rights in the context of the Roman Empire. And it is from there, this idea of the tribus, that the whole idea of the tribes really came. And initially, if you look at a dictionary, it primarily says that tribals or tribe can be understood as people who have a common ancestry. And by defining that, you can think of anyone as belonging to the tribe. So it was really a harmless, what is called thinking, or harmless definitions of the tribe, that anyone who, a community of people who had a common heritage or common ancestry were identified as tribes. Now, this idea of the tribe, the category of tribe, underwent change. And in the 13th century, the tribe was more used in the biblical context of the 13th division among the Israelites. That was the context in which it was used. So you had tribes during Roman Empire, tribes in the biblical context, and then gradually you find that tribals actually moved around 16th century in the biological context as well, where tribe was primarily or being seen in terms of the race or in terms of people with certain kinds of physical features. It is so you find that it was growing itself, or it was coming closer to the whole idea of race. But then the concept of tribe in the way in which we use today in the modern context is primarily to be traced with the Euro-American colonialism, with the Europeans moving to the Americas and getting acquainted with the people who were very different than the Europeans. And they started using or referring that kind of a society or community as tribes, because for them they exhibited the features of what is known as being a savage. So you find that it is in the 16th century onwards that the idea of tribe gets associated with the idea of being a savage, or being a primitive. And if you want really put a more modest word, then it is more of a backwardness. So you find that the pejorative sense into the idea of the category of tribes actually starts with the expansion of the European colonialism. And subsequently, you find that the study of tribe became a typical concern of anthropologists. But anthropology itself, as a discipline, really emerged only towards the end of the 19th century, more specifically beginning of the 20th century. So if you look at as to when the Oxford University was set up or when Cambridge really came up, when anthropology began to study in America, you will find that most of these departments came in the early turn of the 20th century. So, but the idea of tribe was circulating among the colonial administrators, the travelers, and others even before it became a specific concern of the department or of the discipline of anthropology. Now, so when we come to in India, therefore you find that one has to really look at the studies or the ideas of the concerning tribes, let's say from the colonial state, from the coming of the British rule, and then really moving forward and see as to when you find that the nationalists began to think about the tribal questions and how did they really look at the tribes, then what really happens at the eve of independence, what is the driving idea in terms of which the nationalist leadership or the people who really waged freedom struggle movement, how they thought about tribes, and as to how that idea gets really institutionalized in the Indian constitution. And then gradually we follow to the fact that as to how anthropologists began to see the tribal questions in India. And then we move to some of the other disciplines which really joined up, particularly the history and subaltern studies, probably one of the major, let's say, segment of the history, which actually to some extent began to engage with the kind of issues, not very prominently, but nevertheless in some ways with the tribal studies. And then gradually we find that by the in the early, what's called from late 90s and the early 20s, you find that there has been a growth of native scholars from within their own community. And they have been thinking and writing, and therefore they are creating certain kinds of ideas about the tribe. So it is the kind of trajectory that I'm really going to follow. So let's take in fact, the way in which the ideas about tribes were shaped was primarily was a product of the colonial state of the British rule. And as I said that although the category of tribe had become well entrenched in European scholarship or European thought, but the British or the British colonial administrators were not really very sure as to how to delineate this whole category of tribes in Indian context. And if you really look at the kind of what is called monograph or ethnography that were really being produced, then you find that they were using the term and caste almost interchangeably or synonymously. I think that was largely to do with the fact that they themselves were not clear as to how they really think about it, how they really conceptualize Indian society or Indian social structure, whether it was a nationality or whether it was primarily characterized by religion, and therefore it was a kind of civilizational complex. So that really took a lot of time for them to figure out as to how to conceptualize Indian society. And as and when they conceptualize Indian society, you find their ideas as to how to think about tribes somewhat became more clearer. Otherwise, earlier, you find that there were this kind of confusion, as I told you, about interchangeability or synonymous terms. So they talk about the Aboriginal tribes, Aboriginal, semi-Hinduized Aboriginal tribes. So on the one hand, you find that there are tribes who are becoming Hinduized, and yet they are a part of the Aboriginal identity. So they were, this was not very, very clear about them. So in other words, what you find that in thinking about the tribes, the colonial administrative scholars were very, very important. But most important, again, colonial administrative officers who were concerned with the census. In fact, they, in a way, more prominently shaped the idea of the tribe. because you find that in order to make policy about the tribals, you have to have some classifications and the enumerations of the populations, so as to address the policy towards them, whether these are good policies or bad policies, but nevertheless that is the concern. And with that, you find in census there have been constant enumerations of the tribal communities. But even if you look at the census, it very clearly shows that there has been a certain kinds of ambiguity in terms of their own understanding about the tribes. If you look at the 1881 census, they will give you the agricultural and pastoral castes. And within that, they will give you the forest tribes. So they, in other words, tribes were a part of the agricultural and pastoral castes. So not only the what is called colonial administrative scholars were writing monographs on various groups, but even the census commissioners were confused, and they used this kind of, they had a dilemma about this. It is only in 1901 that you find that there was a more specific way of delineating the tribes. And that really came, I think, when Risley was the commissioner. And for the first time, you find that tribes began to be delineated or described in terms of their religious practices. And animism became a criteria in terms of which tribes really began to delineate. And that is the criteria on the basis of which therefore they are different from the others. So they were differentiated from the larger part of people who were part of the civilization on the basis of these aspects of the religious practices. So this animism as the criteria went on as the basis on which tribals were delineated almost in 1991, 1911, 1921, they talked about tribal religions. So that in 31. So you find that animism and tribal religion were the formalized characteristics of delineating the tribes. Subsequently, you find other criteria were added into it in the sense that they were in they lived in isolation, they were in the interiors, either in the hills, or the forests, and so on and so forth. So you find that isolation also became an important characteristic. So this is the way in which you find as to how what is called the colonials really look at. So, and therefore you find that most of the social scientists have argued that the whole category of tribe is a colonial construction, because it is they who really constructed the whole idea of the tribe. And unlike caste, where you find that there was a native scholarship who had an idea about what it is. Therefore, in case of the tribals, there was no literary traditions, there were no speakers, and therefore they didn't have what is called the documents, elaborate documents in terms of how they presented themselves. So you find that the colonialists, in the way in which they thought about is basically try to talk about as a colonial construction. But if you really look at it, to go beyond that, then you find that even before the colonial constructions, you find that Indian, what is called Sanskritic text, whether you talk of mythology or other kinds of texts or stories, in fact, has a almost similar idea of the way in which they conceived of the tribal people who were not really part of the civilization. So most of the words that they were using, the terms that were using, was almost like an animal type description. So in the sense that although it was a colonial construction, you find that this idea in fact had some sort of a continuity with already the kind of an idea which the larger, what is called larger Indian society, maybe it is whether you talk of Hinduism or the civilizations, in fact had a notion about the tribe. So in that sense, I think there was some degree of a continuity, let's see, even on this colonial constructions, so that it was implanted directly from the West, or it was in fact reinforced with already an idea which was already there in an Indian context that really needs to be really thought about. So this is the thing. So the next important idea that comes in the context of understanding tribes is, of course, around the 1930s, 1940s. And I think, this idea really comes with the writings of Berir Elvin. Berir Elvin wrote a book, The Bagger. And if you really read that book, you find that he actually described, there was so much of empathy of Elvin with the way in which baggers had got transformed because of the contact with the outside world. that he was so much disturbed because they were always losing control over land. They were denying access to forests, and they were getting indebted. And therefore, he says, yeah, they have almost lost the nerve of life. So it is in that context, therefore, he brought out a pamphlet, I think in 1943, the Aboriginals, and where he in fact expressed this idea that in order to address the tribal problem in India, they must really be kept in isolation, because any contact with them has played a very devastating effect on their resources, on their life, and so on and so forth. So it is in that context, therefore, you have to think of the G.S. Ghurye, who wrote that book again in 1943, the so-called Aboriginals, where he actually debunks the Aylwin's theory or Aylwin's thinking or Aylwin's perspective, and where he argues that only way left for the tribes to get out of the situation in which they are is to get assimilated with the larger Indian society. He formulated the term of, he saw the tribes primarily as backward Hindus. And because you find that certain kinds of ethnography or certain kinds of empirical materials which the colonialists had produced, in fact, showed that there was so much of overlapping between the caste Hindus who were on the periphery of the tribal areas and the tribes who have become Hinduized, who have become influenced. And therefore, you find that there is so much of an overlapping, and it was very difficult to find out, as I already pointed out, in terms of who are really tribes and who are really Hindus, or who are not really Hindus, or who are tribes and who are not really non-tribes. So that was the kind of, and therefore he took that kind of an empirical situations, and also, the kind of an idea that they were already Hindus, and therefore if they have become somewhat very different, then that was basically a debasement of the Hindu tradition itself. So the more Hindu tradition moved elsewhere, the frontiers, you find that it got it got pulverized, or it became debased. And therefore this is basically talks about the backward Hindus. So if they have to be taken out from the kind of development that they are located in, then they must really be assimilated. So you find this whole idea comes from the isolation of Aylwin to assimilation of the Ghurye. And these are the two kinds of perspectives that you find when you are really thinking about the tribes. Now, these were all being happening in 1940s. And the 1947 was India's independence. So these ideas were something which were quite dominant. And it is, let's say, so when India became free, the founding fathers of the Indian constitutions, or those who really were part of the freedom struggle movement, in fact, they had, let's say, they had a concern about not only Dalits, but also about the tribes. And they were trying to figure out as to what is the kind of policy that really needs to be adopted. And the view was that tribals were kept in isolation, and it is precisely because of this isolation that they are in the situation in which they are. And therefore, there's a need to bring them at par with the larger Indian society in terms of developments, or in terms of being a part of the larger, let's say, a democratic or larger developmental process in India. And it is keeping that in mind that you find that the certain kinds of provisions were made in the constitution. But if you look at what is that idea that drove founding fathers of Indian constitutions in terms of providing, let's say, a provision, the idea was precisely in terms of socio-cultural terms, that they are primitive, that they are backward, and they need to be integrated. They were isolated, and therefore they need to be integrated with the larger Indian society. So at the same time, you find that there were some alternative ideas in circulation at that time, particularly, let's say, in the eastern and central India. And this was the category of being an Adivasi. And Adivasi gave an entirely different notions of what they are. They were not thinking in terms of the socio-cultural category, but in terms of the fact that we are the original inhabitants, and therefore insider outsider, and therefore insider outsider was leading to a kind of political and economic dominance whether they were talking about the regional context, whether they were talking about Indian context, but nevertheless, the idea of Adivasi, in fact, gave rise to a kind of perspective where you are bringing the economic and political dominations at the forefront, and as to how you find that the people who came later on to the tribal areas, how they began to exploit, and therefore the idea of indigenous, we are really indigenous people, we are Adivasis, and therefore you find that although that idea was circulating, you find that the larger nationalist leadership was swayed by the idea of the savage, the backwardness, primitive, and therefore socio-cultural really became more important. And if you look at the constitutions, therefore, you find that it is keeping that in mind, they began to think in terms of providing certain kinds of affirmative action programs. So you integrate them. In other words, you find that the whole idea was to bring them into so-called, I don't use mainstream, but so-called the larger Indian society, integrate them. And if you really look at carefully the Indian constitution, what is Indian constitution? It's primarily, through my mind, I find that it is a kind of framework as to how the tribals could be integrated within the larger Indian society. Because the idea of assimilation was done away with, so also the isolation. And therefore, they took the middle path of integrations, and you find that they are really using this as a kind of framework. And when I read constitutions, to some extent, yes, there is a kind of framework of integration, because it does talk about trying to safeguard the tribal interests. It talks about language. It talks about, in certain sense, distinctiveness and all that. And within that, keeping that in distinctness, also try to integrate them with the larger kind of society. That's it. But then, this is the constitutional framework. And even people talk about this, the principles which Elvin enunciated as the principles for the tribal development. To my mind, is nothing else but a sort of an elaborations of the Indian constitutions in a more succinct form, let's say in the context of philosophy for NEPA. So you find that the philosophy for NEPA was primarily for the, it is always a problematic, whether that was a philosophy for the NEPA or it was really philosophy for the whole of the tribal population in India. Because most of the people, administrators and others have taken that principles as the guiding principles of the tribal development, let's say all over India. But if you really examine carefully, those are not really principles. Those principles from the very beginning, even Jawaharlal Nehru enunciated as these 5 principles. If you start looking at in terms of the way in which India's model of development began, then exactly they were trying to erode those very principles, let's say from the late 50s and the early 60s and so on and so forth. So that dilemma remains. In other words, what you really find that when we move to post-independent India, still you find socio-cultural dimension was important. The other dimension, the economic and political dominations, that remain very ambivalent. And therefore, what do you find? If you look at political and economic, what's called arrangement, you will find that there is a continuation from the post-colonial India. The pre-colonial, colonial India. So if you look at the colonial India, you find it was a framework of colonialism. But and you find that in colonial India, there were twofold colonialism. One was the colonialism of the British, and the other is a colonialism of the people who were migrating or immigrating and settling, let's say, into the tribal areas. So most of the freedom struggle movement, the authors, they always talk about the struggle of the tribals as a struggle against the British. Yes, it was against the British, but one must understand that it was also a struggle. It was a, what is called revolt against the people who have settled into that area. So what I'm trying to say, there was a kind of control by the British in terms of providing a legal and administrative framework, and which was really exploitative, because you find that as to how forests, the access to forests or the control and management which tribals had over the forest, in fact, how it was really being appropriated by the colonial state. And you find that as to how you find that the non-tribals were moving into it. And they introduced also what you call the market. They introduced the commodity market, they introduced the labor market, they introduced the credit market. And you find that through these introductions of commodity, land, labor, and credit market, they completely exploited the labor. So they laid down the legal and administrative framework for the non-tribals to really exploit. So one cannot really say, therefore, that colonialism was only of the British. The framework which was used, in fact, was a framework which was provided, in fact, was used by the people who were migrating in terms of exploiting. And that is where you find that there was a twofold of colonialism which was there. Now, one fold of colonialism is gone, the British, but the legal and administrative framework by and large have remained intact. In terms of what you call the fifth schedule, and the sixth schedule was a novelty because new innovative ideas was provided in terms of autonomous districts council. But if you look at the fifth schedule area, it is a continuation of the kind of an arrangement which was already there. Yes, British in fact wanted to safeguard the tribal interest vis-a-vis the non-tribals. But then what you really find that through introducing the market, they in fact allowed the tribals to be exploited. So what you really find that in post-colonial India, you find that the colonialism which was there, one mode of colonialism in the sense in terms of people gone, but in terms of legal and administrative framework and the people who are using that framework to exploit tribals, in fact, continues. And therefore, I said that even in post-independent India, although we become a part, we have constitutions and we are being integrated in the larger Indian society, as far as the tribal areas is concerned, you find that still we are in the kind of a colonial mode, what is called colonial framework. There's colonialism which is at work. And it is in that context that you find the kind of development that is happening, particularly if you take the peninsular India, not so much Northeast India, but particularly peninsular India, you find that colonialism is vividly present in very acute form even today. So this is the kind of problems you really find. Now, what you find in post-independent India is that the idea of after the what is called the framing of the Indian constitutions, in the way in which people began to think about the tribals, you find that it continued in the sense that Indian constitutions, because there was a reservations for the tribals, in fact, it reinforced the kind of framework which was already there in terms of looking at the tribal context. So you find that it reinforces the caste lens, because there's a reservation for Dalits, there's a reservation for tribals. So looking at tribes from the lens of caste gets in fact reinforced, let's say, in the post-independent India. And if you really look at the kind of work which has really been done, let's say, by people like N.K. Bose, particular anthropologists, N.K. Bose, Surajit Sinha, and others, you find that to them, the kind of transformation that is really happening in the tribal society is basically a kind of transformation which is moving from being a tribe to the caste society. If you look at N.K. Bose, the Hindu method of tribal absorption, what does it really say? That the Hindu system is technologically and culturally superior. And as it interacts with the tribal people, you find the tribal people find it more appropriate. The Hindu social organizations and Hindu, what is called the superior technology and culture, and therefore they absorb themselves because it provides a kind of a security. So he's saying that as to how you find that civilization is influencing them, and as to how you find tribals are getting influenced and becoming a part of the civilizational complex, and in the process you're becoming a caste. So that's similarly you find Surajit Sinha also really talks about, in fact, it talks about tribes as dimensions of little tradition. So even in the context of India, you find that there is a great tradition, that is Sanskritic tradition, and there is a traditions of the village, which is known as little tradition. So Surajit Sinha, in fact, in the context of tribes, already starts thinking of the tribes primarily in terms of being a little tradition. In a sense, almost he is looking at tribals in the same lens as he looks at the rural society. And of course, then he gives a very interesting things in the sense as to how the state formation, in fact, became a kind of an instrument of the change or kind of movement of the tribals towards, let's say, becoming a kind of a caste. No, so this is, and you find, therefore, you find much of the writings in the post-independent India is basically moving in the directions of the transformation the tribals are undergoing. The transformation the tribals are undergoing is either is moving and becoming a part of the caste, or they're becoming a peasant, or they're becoming a kind of very social differentiated in terms of a class. In the process, what they say, the tribals are becoming, losing their identity. They have no tribes because tribals are becoming, they're getting fused into caste, they're becoming a peasant, and they're becoming socially differentiated, which is the marked characteristics of the larger Indian society. And therefore you find tribals are actually losing their identity. Now this becomes a serious problematic because in order to understand tribes, I think we have to look at that when you talk about tribes, first, tribes are a society. Secondly, tribes a particular type of society. And thirdly, that tribes has always represented, let's say, in terms of looking at tribes in terms of stages in the development of society. So yes, stages of development, there has been change. They are no longer shifting cultivators, they're no longer agriculturists, they're becoming politicians, they're becoming bureaucrats, they're becoming what's called civil servants, they're becoming businessmen and so on and so forth. So that's what is really the characteristics of the larger Indian society. Or you find they're becoming peasants more like a peasants. So you find that you started thinking any kind of transformation that was really happening. So if you're really moving a little bit of a caste, they're saying you're becoming caste. If you say you're becoming peasant, you're becoming peasant. If you're becoming other way, they're becoming caste. In the process, you find the tribals are actually no more. Now, this is something I thought was very problematic because in order to understand that, we have to think of the three dimensions in terms of tribes has to be conceptual. One is a tribe as a society, tribe as a type of society, and tribe as a stage in the development of society. So although you find as the stage and the type of society may have undergone change, but tribe as a society in the sense maybe a Khasi or the Jaintia or a Gond or a Bhil, he remains as a society. You cannot really, I always give an example that if Bengali, he gets anglicized and he transforms himself, it doesn't cease to be Bengali. So, but in the case of much of the literature in the context of tribes, it's always said the transformation as to how tribals are actually ceasing to be what they were and they're getting transformed. That I think is a big, what is called faulty way of looking at the kind of transform. So tribals are, yes, they're undergoing change like any other society. And therefore you find that tribals, we have to see that when you talk about tribes as a society, we have to talk in terms of what they represent. They represent maybe a Gond, they represent a Santhal, they represent, let's say, a Khasi, and therefore you find as a society they remain, and as a society they are undergoing change, and therefore you cannot really deny. So as any other society is undergoing change, in fact, tribal society is also undergoing change. So they're becoming, someone becoming Hinduized, someone becoming Christianized, someone becoming middle class, someone is becoming agricultural laborer. It is like any other society, that kind of change. But earlier traditions of looking at change is that that's how tribals are getting integrated into the larger Indian society and thereby losing their own identity. So you find that in earlier traditions, you said that there was only one way for the tribals to undergo change, and that was to change themselves or to get transformed themselves and becoming a part of the larger Indian society. That has not really happened. They still maintain their kind of a distinct identity. So that's, I think, is something which really is important to understand. Just a minute. Yeah. Now, therefore, what you really find is that much of the writings on tribes by something which has been produced is primarily from the lens of scholars who were really part of the dominant Indian society. Now, that tradition to some extent got fractured when you find the subaltern school really came up. Subaltern school in that sense was somewhat different in the sense that it was trying to give certain kinds of autonomy to the people in terms of as to how they wage their struggle. And they introduced this whole idea of the consciousness. From the consciousness you are really looking at. So you find that the kind of writing of history that was really happening earlier, it was a very important departure, as I said. and the consciousness is really being brought out. But even when you look at the subaltern schools, I have not studied in detail, but I've read the first book by Ranajit Guha, Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India. And I was looking because he was the forerunner of the subaltern school. And you find that although he's really talking about the consciousness, negation of what's called the as to how you identify your identity in terms of the exploiter, in terms of the as to how crime is the pre-runner of the what is called protest and the movement, the whole idea of solidarity and the kind of territoriality which does not go beyond certain point. Now, all these ideas are very, very important. But much of the examples that it talks about is from the tribal society. Of course, it takes from the tribals as well, but from tribal society, particularly Santals. And in the process, it talks about the peasants, what is called elementary aspect of peasant insurgents in colonial India. And therefore, the tribals like Santals, who have a very different kind of traditions, he's almost equating them like peasants. And therefore, the distinction between peasants and the tribals who form a entirely different kind of socio-cultural identity, in fact, is really gets lost sight of. So even in subaltern schools, so when we talk about the consciousness, so whether it is a consciousness of the peasant and consciousness of a Santhal, who is a peasant, at the same time belong to different socio-cultural category, is it really the same, or you find that there is that should really constitute a kind of subaltern? So I think there's a layers that one has to really look at, and that really one has to really look on that. Now, what is the time now? Yeah. So what we really find now is that the writing on the tribes predominantly came from either the colonial administrators, or it came from the dominant, let's say, the society either belonging to certain linguistic communities. And it is time for us to look at as to how they have really tried to understand the tribal society. And it is in this context that I think one really needs to look at. Particularly, I would like to examine in the context of the Northeast. The 70s and 80s, as I said, since the tribals have primarily been studied by the anthropologists, because that was really remained a special prerogative of the anthropological discipline. You find that whatever they have been studied, it become a kind of a source material. And there has been no thinking on those societies from the people who are really part of the society. In the sense, natives themselves have not really thought about it. It is from the 90s or early 20, what's called from the 1990s, you find that a new phenomena is emerging in the context of tribes. And that is, you find that the tribal people who were earlier going for administration, increasingly moving to the academics, including moving to the research. And you find that now a space has been created, let's say, in terms of the tribal collectives or tribal intellectuals. So you find that this began, let's say, sometimes around this phenomena began to emerge, particularly if you look at the larger India, particularly Delhi. It begins to emerge sometime in the 1990s, late 1990s onwards. So earlier, what you find that tribal students used to come, study, but they go back and or move into the administration. But taking academics as a vocation, taking academics as something on which they want to make their what is called the living and their writing, this was not there, but that has really undergone change. And today you find that increasingly large number of people taking, let's say, research as seriously, becoming MPhil, PhD students, going to universities, began to teach in academics. So this is a new phenomena which actually you find in Delhi sometimes around the 1990s onwards, or 201 onwards. But this was already happening in the Northeast, particularly with the coming of the Northeastern Hill University at Shillong, which came in the 1970s. It was part of the new kind of thinking about the Northeast. And Northeastern Hill University, although initially you find that large number of faculties who went there were from outside, but very soon you find that by the 80s, and most importantly, by the 90s, you find large number of native scholars really grew out of that university, either as a historian, as a sociologist, as an economist, as an anthropologist, and so on and so forth. Now, that was the beginning of the emergence of the native scholars. I'm not saying that earlier it was not there, earlier it was there, but more of an exception. But you find that a kind of a critical mass had begun to emerge from the 1980s onward. And I think NEHO played a very pioneering role into it. So a lot of people went, let's say the academics, they may not have written much, but nevertheless, in terms of pursuing the production of knowledge or dissemination of knowledge became one of the very important concern. And but that agenda has been more extensively taken by the by 201s and 210s and so on. Today you find the large sample. Now the problem how do we really look at therefore? And if you really look at most of the people who have been grown as an academics or emerging as an academics, they are trying to study their own society. And I think it is important for us to see as to how we look at the volume of works that have been produced, particularly if you take because Northeast, a lot of scholars are coming from the Northeast. I would like to look at as to how and what way you find that the colonialists really wrote, or the missionaries really wrote about the tribal people in the Northeast. What did they do? What was the lens from which they really looked at? Then you find that the 50s and 60s, you find a lot of Assamese and the Bengali scholars, and what is called historians, or you find anthropology or sociology, began to write on the region. So how do they really write? And now that you find a new emergent leadership has come from the natives, how do they really look at? Do they continue the same kind of a work, or you find that they're looking at the tribal society in the lens which is very different from the kind of lens from which, in fact, let's say the colonialists and let's say the regional scholars really wrote about the tribal people. I think this is something we have to really think about it in terms of the kind of work. Now, as we becoming, since tribal scholarship has really grown, we have to really look at it for how do we really go about doing that. And I'm not very rigid about it. I think we get, as we academics, we grow and we get influenced by the kind of schools of thought that is there, let's say in sociology and anthropology or in history. And I think if you take that kind of perspective and even then you reflect on the tribal questions, let's say, of which we are part, I think this is an important contribution. But I think we also have to find out, is there a new kind of lens as people writing from within, writing from our own society? Can we really provide a new kind of new ways of looking at the tribal society? I think that is where I think we are at today. So the new lens, how does it really come? And is there a possibility of creating a new lens from which we really look at? I think this is the agenda which we have to really follow. But in terms of the kind of work that so far we as tribal academics have worked, I feel that we have still moved, we are still on the mode of community, collectivity, tribes. And we are looking at everything in terms of the tribe. I think tribe has undergone change and transformation. And we have to really look at whether we further our understanding in terms of looking at the transformation that really has happened. We are not really grappling with the kind of transformation. We are still stuck with as a community, and as a community we really look at, but as a community we have also undergone change. And I think it's important for us to grapple with that change. And the process of change, you find that there are many things that have been lost and many things that have been gained. For example, this whole idea of the gender that it really comes in. The gender was something I think we had not really taken very seriously. And as to how you find the kind of transformation, gender inequality, and which is pervasive, let's say, in most of the tribal societies, is to be explored. Similarly, you find that we are maybe we are middle class, but you find there is landlessness coming up. There's a landless laborer. There is the people who we are becoming urbanized now. This urbanization is again a very important phenomenon which has emerged. You find that large chunk of people earlier, let's say, since urbanization is much more in the Northeast, is also happening. But then since people who are living in the Northeast, the towns are much larger in number than as compared to the mainland India, you find that, we are no longer in the rural context. We have moved into the urban context. And therefore, how do we really look at the urban context? How do we really look at ourselves? And I think this is an important for us, therefore, as I said, rather than just still tagging ourselves in terms of community and as to community really is looking at. That's an important, because I think large body of literature has come which we need to critique, and therefore I'm not really saying that that should not be, but we also need to go beyond that and look at the kind of transformation that has really taken place in terms of inequality, in terms of gender inequality, in terms of class, in terms of differentiation, and see as to how we really address this kind of problems as well. I think these are all important issues that we really need to take up. And therefore, finally, I think what we really want to do is that the tribal studies today, you find that although tribe is being studied for such a long period of time, as I said, the colonial administrators, they had shown concern. Of course, at that time, they have also shown concerns with the caste. But anthropologists have been typically concerned with the study of tribes. And even the first department of anthropology really came in 1921, Calcutta University. You find that there was an interesting division of labor in the case of India, as it was the case in Europe as well. If people studied their modern society, complex society, they were sociologists. If they studied the other society, it became a kind of an anthropology. Now, that kind of division which was there in Europe has been reproduced in India as well. And therefore, you find in case of India, if your Department of Sociology was primarily oriented to study of complex society, namely Hindu caste society or civilization, whereas anthropology was supposed to study the tribes. That was the kind of division. And therefore, if you look at the kind of department of anthropology really came up, it came up more in the areas where there were predominantly tribal populations. You have Calcutta University, you have Gauhati University, you have Ranchi University, you have Raipur University. So you find that anthropology really became very, very important. Now, so anthropology has been engaged with the study of tribes for almost now since 1920. And you have Department of Anthropological Survey of India, Tribal Research Institute. So you have all these kinds of an institute. But despite the fact that the tribes are being studied for so many years, have we really been able to throw the discourse on tribes or debates on tribes at the national level or the regional level? The extent to which you find the discourse you find of the Dalits at the national level and the regional level, or of the gender issues, because there were no specific department of Dalit studies. Even the social exclusion department, which study of social exclusion inclusive studies, came only in 1990s. And that was not, again, exclusively meant for Dalits. Then you find women's department, women's studies center, it came almost from the late 1970s or 80s. So the disciplines which have this what is called the Dalits and what is called the women, in fact, study a systematic study of theirs. In fact, it's a very late entry, and look at the way in which the debate and discussions has really developed. Whereas the study of tribes has almost been for almost, let's say, 80 years or so, more than 80 years or almost 100 years now. And look at the way in which the ideas about tribes, the issues about tribes as actually, where it is not really reflected in the discourse, not at the national level, not at the regional level. So this is where we are. And I think it's important for us to create this kind of discourse and this kind of a debate. Now, it comes only when you find that the issue of tribes moves beyond a particular discipline. So far, too much of an anthropological concerns. I think it is important that an economist studies tribal society, that an historian studies tribal society, a literary man studies society, a person from English literature or a person from Khasi literature or whatever who studies societies. So I think it's important for us to engage with the tribal issues from a different kind of disciplines. And it is this converging of the disciplines in terms and looking at the tribal society, which I think will bring more vitality to the tribal studies than what it is. I think this is where I think we have to really do it. If you really think about the tribal studies, then I think it is important for us to work from a different lens or from different angles, from different kind of disciplines in which we are educated, and see as to how we really come forward. And also look at as to how we really talk among ourselves rather than linguistics and like anthropologists, sociologists, or social worker. We have to really find out our ways in which we come together, we integrate, and really take various kinds of issues which remains unexplored. And I think that's where I think we are need to create the kind of an agenda. So I think it is a high time for us, to look at the society of which we are really part from the kind of trials and tribulations that we have been going through in our own life, in our own society, in our own history. And we have to see as to how we present a mirror of that. And in presenting that mirror, we find that still we are in a kind of situation which is economic and politically dominated. We find that we don't have that kind of space. Reorganization of the state in terms of linguistic lines, in fact, created a kind of an hegemony over the tribals again, because tribals were not really given that kind of over the state, although there had been demand. But then we have been fragmented into the many of these states, and now we are getting sucked into the kind of the language of different states. And in the process, we find that we are actually forgetting our own language. And the moment we forget our own language, you find that we are really going to lose our own identity. So I think in terms of creating that, we have to see as to where we really go. Of course, if you really, the beginning, that tribal studies began with the colonial period because the missionaries and the colonial administrators were writing. A lot of books have come, a lot of monographs have come. But I think sometimes you have to go even pre-colonial period. So what do we do when you go to pre-colonial period? Before British came, what will we are? How do we really construct that? And therefore, there's a need for reconstructing that part as well. We have to retrieve, we have to recover that. And how do we really do? These are challenges. But nevertheless, I feel it is important for us to think about that rather than starting with the British. We have also to fall back and see as to how we are, what were the kind of situations that we were in terms of understanding the pre-colonial past. So I think today there's a much more chance for us to do it because of the various kinds of things. The interdisciplinary issues teams coming together, working together, and this is the way in which you can really take forward. And that is how we have to create a kind of debate and discourse. Finally, on a note, I think although we talk about tribes, I think, and surely this idea of tribes gives us notion of commonality. But I think as an academics, we have still been very much narrowed down to our area. People from the peninsular India or eastern India, they don't participate in the kind of debate and discussion that really happening on the Northeast. And the people from the Northeast, they don't show that kind of interest as to the kind of debates and discourse that are really happening, let's say, in the peninsular India. I think we have to go beyond that. If we really want to understand as a tribe, there was some commonality. Yes, there are historical differences, the entrenchment of the colonial rule and others. But nevertheless, I think we have to start talking. We have to start dialogue rather than just trying to look at it in kind of regional context and see if there's a possibility for us to move beyond the regional context and to start a kind of a dialogue or a kind of studies which moves beyond, as I said, the regional context and takes pan-Indian situations of the tribal communities in India. So that is where I think I just would like to end it. Thank you so much for your listening.
Okay, so Ruby, something? Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, thank you, Dr. Kaka, for that illuminating lecture, chronicling the trajectory of tribal studies in India through confronting the term tribe itself. So it really helps us understand who we are and what really these studies that people are not really sure we still have as a discourse. So, I mean, this notion of commonality that you talked about, I think is one that is urgent, and bringing in the differences of how central India or peninsular India and northeast India look at the or pay attention to our own discourses in special ways, not really looking at ways of coming together, I think is again an urgent call. We have a lot of questions I can see, but first I will call upon Professor Bodhi to respond to this talk. And then we see, according to how time permits us, what we will do with opening up the discussion. So, Professor Bodhi.
So yes, I was also, thank you, Ruby. Thank you so much, Professor Kaka. I was looking at many of the questions that people have put up. There's some very interesting questions. But I guess being a first lecture, I think it's important to us to kind of stick to the framework of the lecture itself, as in to attempt to understand the evolution of tribal studies and to see tribal studies from a very critical perspective, the way Professor Kaka has done. So many of us who are scholars and engaging on tribal issues in the country, extremely enriching. I mean, many of us have read these kind of processes, but we are not able to make sense of the totality of what has happened in tribal studies and how it has evolved. What are the kind of issues that have actually erupted from time to time, you know, with nearly 300, 400 years of history. So my suggestion is that we will not take up questions in the sense of individual questions by participants. We have so many participants today, and we have many members of the Tribal Intellectual Collective also. I'm sure many of you have a lot of questions, but it's impossible to take questions, each and every question. So what I will basically try to do is try to kind of bring all of these small questions, all the questions that you've asked, and kind of summarize them a little bit and put it for Professor Kaka's final reflection. We are running short of time a little bit. So to put it for him to reflect on some of these issues which he has raised, much more from a perspective that we are trying to engage with today. So 2-3 points I think are being brought by participants in the messages that they've sent. Some of the questions are, they are academic, but they engage with the larger political processes in the country, which I think at this point in time we should kind of just leave it for another debate some other time. There are so many processes taking place in the country, very political, very controversial. We will keep them aside for this, for at least for this gathering. But there's some interesting questions, mostly related to how do we begin to understand, like as scholars of tribal studies, how do we begin to understand in a more nuanced manner about these constructs produced in the time of colonialism and in the constructs produced post-colonialism? Like, how do we begin to think about these processes in terms of categories, in terms of constructs produced by context from time to time that we have experienced in terms of the evolution of Indian reality? So there is one question related to that kind of an issue. Another one is a question related to this idea of mainstream. Like, how do you basically engage with this idea of mainstream? And tribal societies being who they are, a mere small population of about 7% or so in a population that has caste society, which is 90% or so. How do you begin to reimagine the notion of the mainstream? Is there any other category by which we can now reimagine this whole idea of who is the mainstream? How do we conceive? What happens when you are not the mainstream? What are the kind of processes, especially exclusionary processes, both theoretically and politically, that actually shapes up when you are not the mainstream? We're in the periphery of that mainstream. So we can understand this in terms of politics, but how do we understand this in terms of theory? Like, how do we position and reposition ourselves in the light of this kind of a debate, in which there is a powerful voice emerging from caste society about the non-mainstream societies and so on and so forth? We see a number of books that has come. One of our own colleagues, Professor Bhangya Bugya, has recently written a book on this, which is a very interesting debate. So the next question is about this mainstream. How do we kind of problematize the notion of the mainstream, at least theoretically, and if possible, methodologically? Like, what is the method by which we begin to re-engage with this idea of mainstream? There are also some questions related to this idea of which you raise of why is it that the studies in the departments of tribal studies, especially locked and located in anthropological departments, which began, as you said, in 1920s in Calcutta, why is it that the knowledge produced from anthropology has never been, to a great extent, in comparison to gender studies and also in comparison to Dalit studies, has never shown any emancipatory element, has never shown any element of being able to produce a new discourse about the tribes. So this notion of the production of knowledge and knowledge as a fundamental force of change, so this idea, which is to do with the way you have put it, which is very interesting, I guess, it's like, oh, then what do we probably do? I mean, it's difficult to kind of answer a question like that, but just how your reflections about how do we engage with this production of a new knowledge that has emancipatory elements that when compared to gender studies or Dalit studies can actually propel change, and propel change that is empowering and not hegemonic in the sense of control of the tribes further. So this is another question that has kind of been sent by people. Some people have sent for everybody, but some people have sent private questions, which I think is important. So the third point, which I think some people are asking, is that you spoke about tribal society, about approaching the study of tribal societies from the society perspective or the type of society perspective, or by stages of development. I mean, the debate about the stages of development is interesting because we have been caught in many other processes. Modernity itself is a concept and a construct produced in which the framework of modernity has put the tribes into the most backward state of development. So there are many structures in which when you begin to produce knowledge, these structures are already there. And the debate about modernity, like how do we begin to think differently about modernity? Why is it that tribes are not modern? And who is it who construct the tribes as unmodern? And who are these who are modern? So is modernity really a reality, or is it a construct of people around certain structures because they dominate that particular structure? So while tribe as society is not so difficult to understand, and tribe as a type of society also is a beautiful argument that you have put forth, and your articles also speaks plenty about this kind of an argument. But this tribe as stage of development, how do we confront this notion of stage of development when the very structure of knowledge, not only reproduce the notion of the unmodern, but not only that, but they marginalize people in this particular process of the production of what we come to know as modernity. So that's another reflection probably we can have. And the last point is this idea of which you put forth about the whole process of the peasantization of tribes, and also the new point that you brought in. I mean, many of us have been studying these processes, but I think today you added a very interesting concept, not only the peasantization of tribes, but the subalternization of tribes. Like how is it that when some scholars from, let's say, not from a particular tribal community, when they use the framework of peasantization, then what kind of realities they produce? That we have seen, because there are a lot of empirical work and studies that have been done on that line. But what happens when you produce it from a subalternization perspective? What are the realities that you produce about these tribal realities when you begin to subalternize them? And I asked this in the light of one interesting reflection by a friend of ours. I don't know the person, but he was saying that in the light of this, then how do you begin to understand this endonym, exonym kind of a debate? That is, a category produced by the reality itself, like Adivasi, for instance, and a category constructed, an exonym, a category produced by another to identify and construct you. So between these, there are so many debates of Adivasi, indigenous people. So within that subalternization perspective, what are the other categories possible? I mean, is this the best that subaltern studies can do to tribal realities in the production of categories of the kind that I've just mentioned? Or is it possible that we can rethink these categories and produce categories endonym, which means produced from us, that probably is available, that we can then propel a new tribal studies? So there's so many questions that come. It's difficult to summarize everybody's question. Some of the questions are extremely political for a platform like us, which is a very not so political platform. We are academics. Most of us are academics and concerned about not only in terms of the political process, but in terms of theory, knowledge production, methodology, methods. So we are concerned to get we are keen to get these kind of reflections from you at this point in time. So, and then we can probably close it. And I think if we close it with your last reflection now also, it should be good enough. But I have raised so many questions. I'm very sorry. But Over to Professor Kaka.
Well, thank you. I can't answer all the questions. In fact, as I said that for me, the journey to the tribal studies is my personal journey. I have never been trained and I've never studied it and I've never taught it. To be very frank, I've never taught tribes. I only make presentations whenever I go here and there. But I've never taught tribes in any department, neither in Delhi University nor anywhere I've taught it. So my engagement is more in terms of all these kind of seminars, workshops, and so on and so forth. So I also don't have that kind of clarity. The more I read, the more I find that many of the things that I said in the past, in fact, are something which I can change it. So, these are all learning process. So let me start with the fact that the whole construction. I think there has been all kinds of constructions. And I think much of those constructions are very ideologically oriented. So even in terms of a tribe, when you say primitive or the savage, it is a construction. And I think this is a construction of an anthropology, which or of this colonial state, and then which has been internalized or it was taken away by the anthropology. Anthropology is now setting it away. Now they don't no longer accept this kind of concept. In fact, the category tribe is not seen as an analytical category, and they have almost now done away with it in their studies. So they talk about other culture. And I think even when they bring about the tribal people, they talk about in terms of indigenous people. So I think there's layers. And in case of in India, we have all kinds of categorizations. And this comes again from the different kind of lens. For example, scheduled tribe is of course a category. We might belong socioculturally, linguistically to the same community, but we may not necessarily be scheduled tribes. So there has been a lot of fractions. So I think in terms of understanding is that one is that it has been imposed on us and imposed on us at the national level and imposed on us at the regional context. And I think we have to see that what was the meaning, what was the kind of an ideas or ethos through which this was really in a way thought about it. For example, if you look at Banwasi, now you understand the context within which this has really come. In a sense, so people have their own identity. In fact, even if you look at the tribals, many of the tribals, when they say about them, like Ho, what does it really mean? Who means a man, I am. Like that in the Northeast, you find when it's a we, that basically means a we. So we have, even before the pre-colonial, we had certain kinds of conception about ourselves. I as a Urao, as a Kuduk, I have a Kuduk. But then you have given imposed other kinds of categories. So I think we have to understand, we have to understand the logic behind it. We have to understand the idea behind it. And you find that most of these are to great extent something internalized by us also without understanding what it is. But the moment we are becoming more and more educated, we are questioning this kind of categorization. Let me just say that, the Zangli or primitive is something people have been saying it, but we never took it seriously. But today we find that these are extremely problematic issues. And if you find that there are certain institutions who perpetuate this kind of an idea, as a tribal, as a person coming from a tribe, we become educated and something we are looking at reflecting upon ourselves, I think it becomes a moral obligation on us to question this kind of a collective. So I think, basically is it really something, a category which is dignified? Is it really of dignity? Or you find that the categories which are really being given outside is actually undignified? For example, many of the categories which we had during colonial period, even including tribe. But then you find the tribe also undergoes change. For example, the whole idea of the tribe today. So there are people use the idea of the tribe in very different ways. There are people who use tribe primarily to say you are a Jangli, you are a savage. But we also identify ourselves as a tribes. Like say Northeasterners, rather than identifying an Adivasi, they say we are tribes. Now, what is there? Do they say we are jungly? No. Do they say we are savage? No. Do they say we are primitive? No. So what do you find that when sometimes some of these categories which we internalize, we add a new meaning to it. And it's precisely what you find that is the Northeast. If you go beyond the Northeast as a region and you start identifying in terms of your own identity, particularly if you move out of the regional context, you talk in terms of a tribe, I mean tribe. But that tribe is not you're using in the sense in which you find a main person from the mainland India might be using it. You are using it primarily to say that I belong to a community which is strikingly very different from the kind of community to which you belong. And so I belong to a society which is strikingly very different from the kind of society you belong. So that is where we talk about it. So when you talk about tribe, I'm really talking about in terms of a society that I am. A society which is not based on caste. Where you find social organization is not based on the principles of caste hierarchy. So that is where it really comes. I think therefore you have to, different kind of categories need to be dissected and see whether these are acceptable or not acceptable. Why is it that you find today, for example, even the category tribe, anthropology has discarded it. But we in India, we continue to use it. We use it because it has become a kind of constitutional administrative category. It has become connected with the affirmative action program. So although the idea is problematic, but we are constrained to use it, but then we are now adding new meaning to it in terms of the fact that it is not in the sense of being primitive, not in the sense of backward, but in terms of the fact that we are a people who are very different from the kind of people you are. So that's, I think, so I think this constructions has to be really critically examined in terms of whether it is associated with dignity, it's associated with my self-esteem, or you find that these are the kinds of categories which actually denigrating my identity, my dignity, my self-esteem. That is, I think, what is really important. And sometimes the category which was earlier, let's say, derogatory, in fact, you transform it into a positive things. Like, as I said, sometimes we talk about tribe, then we're adding actual, but then this becomes different lens from which we really talk about it. Now, the other is the mainstream that you talked about. It is it is very difficult to talk about mainstream in the sense that, see, is there a sort of mainstream, and whom do we really refer to the mainstream? Now, this is now the question is, if you look at in India, you know, we are divided into different linguistic groups. So we are different regional groups. And therefore, there is a kind of diversity. And in that diversity, I think we are also a part of the diversity. Now, the moment we don't accept this diversity, then it really becomes problematic. So when we talk about the preamble of the Indian constitutions, what is it say? We the people. But unfortunately, what is really happening that we the people, probably tribals in real empirical situations, in terms of the way the state treats the tribals, in terms of the dominant community treats the tribals, that we the people, in fact, it completely gets lost, and we really become something which are not necessarily we become almost on the periphery, on the frontiers. I think this is largely to do with, empirically, I can say that, well, there is a certain way in which the mainstream as identified, that is primarily moves in terms of the religion, and you know, that seems to be the ethos in terms of which is the. So although you might be Andhraite, you might be Keralite, you might be Malayalam, or you be Bengali or Assamese, there is something which binds. And I think, and that binding in terms of religion comes in terms of caste organization as well. So basically, it's rather than being a part, we have to problematize who is really mainstream. So I think this whole idea of the mainstreaming is what they have been using it, and we have been getting trapped into it. We do think that we have to become a part of it. We have to really challenge. There's nothing like mainstream. I think there are peoples and peoples, and I think we have to just find out as to how we puncture this kind of whole idea of the mainstream. I think, if I'm not mistaken, are we really talking of the mainstream in terms of the socio-cultural linguistics, or are we really going to talk of the mainstream in terms of the values? Are we really going to talk? So the people who are adhering to certain kinds of the values. And I think that is very important. So I think the values, that is what really makes people. So if you are looking hierarchical values, are you really the mainstream? This is a mainstream which is challenged. Now, often, therefore, you find that the even rural Indian society will describe tribes as backward. In what sense? You are as much backward as the tribals are. Probably in terms of values, you are much more backward than the tribe. Maybe only in agricultural sense, in technology you might be developed. But in terms of all values, all terms of values and knowledge, probably you are as backward as anybody else. So I think the whole idea of the mainstream is coming from the fact that we are not because we are in the frontiers, but because we think that we are in terms of economically, politically, in terms of knowledge, in terms of, we are not really at the same level as others, and we really need to do that. So I think I basically I don't like this whole term of mainstream. I think we just have to debunk it and we not to talk about it, rather create a new kind of a discourse in terms of. In fact, Ramdal Minda used to say, we are the mainstream. So if to counter that, we are the mainstream. You are. So what you were talking about it? We have been here for centuries. We are the mainstream. So I think we have to. I'm not clear, but we have to find out ways in which we can really counter that. Anthropology is, it couldn't produce that kind of consciousness and debate. And at that, I've always been talking about it. I have written a paper on this. And fortunately, I'm not an anthropologist, but I was invited by anthropologists, so I wrote this paper and then critiqued anthropology. I think the anthropologists, what you really find is that, for anthropologists, tribals have become a sort of a data. They have no empathy. I think there is a colonial hangover because anthropology was a handmaid of colonialism. And therefore the colonial hangover remains. And you find that in India, you find anthropology has been almost tied with the state, Anthropological Survey of India, Tribal Research Institute. So it is a little difficult to expect an anthropologist to detach himself from the state, from that kind of institutional arrangement. I think, and therefore, so what we will find is that there has been no critical discussions of the tribals and try to bring that kind. They have not discussed about the fact of dispossession. They don't discuss about the displacement. Discuss, but they never bring it at the wider forum. So you find that it is a little difficult to expect this coming from anthropology. It is for us as a knowledge producers now that as to how we bring various kinds of problems that we are facing, either in terms of displacement, in terms of dispossession, in terms of poor governance, in terms of what is called lack of justice, lack of fairness, or in terms of the way in which racism is talked about in case of the Northeast. These are the ways in which we have to really talk about. We have to see as to how we handle this. So I think we have to have a kind of debate we have to generate. And I think if we're really talking about diversity, it is difficult because, numerically and maybe in terms of knowledge productions, we are still at the infant stage. But I think that is where it is important for us as to how we engage ourselves. And also, I think when we write, I always say that when we write, let's not be confined to writing for ourselves. I think we have to, what we have been writing, we have to throw it at the door of the people who write about us. Only when you find that we are questioning it. Otherwise, just writing about ourselves, it will not really take you very far. It is important for us, the kind of ideas which we have, of course, they may reject it. You have to find it out. But then the ideas must circulate it. Ideas must go. It become part of the curriculum and so on and so forth. So that is, I think, how we can do it. And so that is part. Approaches to the study of, yes. See, primarily I say that every society is undergoing change. And tribal societies are undergoing change. You can't expect it to be static. So as a type of society, we were kinship based. Kinship still remains important, but it is getting gradually getting eroded. We were relatively egalitarian. That is also getting eroded. We becoming a kind of inequality, kind of stratification that is really coming up. we are homogeneous. That has also become socially differentiated. We are today Christians or Hinduites or following our traditional religions, or we have Marxist values or liberal values or conservative values. So we are no longer what we really used to be. But in doing so, we do not cease to be the fact that I am a Khasi. There are tendency now that because the change is really happening, to discredit and to say disown that you belong. I think we belong to a common ancestry, a common history, a historical experiences, and it is in terms of that we have to really think about that we are a society. We have undergone change, and we are changing. But as a society, we continue to be together. So I always give a Bengali. He may have different political affiliations. He may have different kind of an ideology. The fact that he remains in Bengali, why do we deny that kind of an identity to the tribals? I think we have to keep in mind that tribe is a category. We are using a kind of descriptive category for people like Khasi, like Gond, like Kurao, the Munda, the Santhal, and so on and so forth. It is for them that the category stands. So the category is one way of looking at it, but I think primarily we belong to that. And if the case was there, then we need not have used the term category, because we are so multitude of communities that we have to have common what is called term in order to understand. But if we are a dominant, like in the case of the Nagas, probably sometimes you may find that, well, there's no need of using the term tribe. You say, I'm a Naga, or I'm a Mizo. The problem is that when you say Mizo or Naga, probably some people may understand it. But when I say that I am a Khasi, what is it? So that's what they will ask you. Then you have to say, I'm a tribe. Oh, you are a tribe. So this is the kind of problems in which we are. But when you are talking about tribal, primarily our identity is belonging to a society. Yes, as a development, we are undergoing change. And that change, maybe how to talk about it. And because we are now maybe second generation people who are getting educated, moving into it. There are people who have 8th generation, 9th generations of the people. So in terms of knowledge productions, we will lag behind. But then I think, but the beginning has already been done, or beginning has already, it has begun. And I think we can take it forward and we can really challenge it. Yes, a peasantization. These are, see, the problem is now the peasantizations and etc. These are all somehow a kind of a term to use that you are losing a tribe, you ceasing to be a tribe. So that caste, peasant, social differentiated, these are the kind of terms in terms of which people try to say that you are losing your tribalness, your tribal identity. I think that is what really becomes that is what really is the issue, and therefore I think these are clearly to be what is called critiqued. So as I said, because I said that we remain as what we are, and therefore in the process, yes, there might be a peasant. Rather than shifting cultivator, I become peasant. So what is peasant? What is shifting cultivator? The peasant, we don't produce, when you produce for subsistence, yes, it is, but then it may not necessarily. So there are ways in which we think about the peasant. The concept of peasant is very different than the concept of tribe. So I think we have to really, and then basically means when to bring about peasant, then you are almost changing the whole idea of the tribe into the concept of the peasant. And thereby again denying that kind of this. So that's why I think it is important for us to find out what exactly is the way in which we identify ourselves. And to me, it's primarily in terms of being a member of a society. What was, is there anything, Bodhi, I don't know, but I'm...
We're just referring to this concept of stages of development and the notion of modernity.
I think we have to look at it. You see, the problem is the modernity. we have now, to my mind, we have moved away from that stage. We are in a way trying to engage ourselves critically. So you find that, it's not that we are irrational. We are, every time we're trying to look at rationally. There are certain kinds of issues where we have problem. But this whole idea to say that we are non-rational and we don't really look at in terms of the reason. I think there's a continuous reasoning process that has been going on. And in terms of even, let's say, if you look the pre-British issues, and in terms of the way the tribals actually thought about the worldview, about the nature, about themselves, about the supernatural, there is certain kinds of reasoning that has been there. So I think the stages of development, etc., I think it is not really important for us. We have already entered into a phenomena where we don't have to talk about in terms of stages. We are as a society. So to me, being stages of society is no longer important to me. We have already entered into a society where we are as much, we are at the same level as the others. So, we are not at the lower level of development. Yes, our participation is not to the, we are much more excluded. But in terms of level of development, we are at a lower level of that doesn't really exist. And the whole idea of hierarchizing that this superior or inferior, this was all colonial hangover. There's today no society is superior, no society is inferior. We are diverse, and diversity must really be respected. So I think I don't think we should really get entangled into the whole idea of what is called the backwardness and the stages of development. I think basically we have to really look at in terms of as to how we are being exploited, how we are being discriminated, how we are unjustly being treated. That are the ideas which are really more important rather than bringing out this idea. We are almost the same level in terms of being a part of the larger society. We are socially differentiated. So I don't see talking about the stages of development any longer.
Okay, so I see that we have reached 6:30. There are many more questions, but I think we'll not be able to take it this time. Probably the next time that we meet, we can have more clarification. There are questions, as I said, many of them are political, but some of them also is related to one very interesting question about your reflections about the Asiatic society. But probably we can take that some other time. So probably we can stop now, and we have also, I mean, there's so much to digest because there's so much that you have said in this 1 hour that we have been listening. So there are many more questions. I'm very sorry that we'll not be able to take all these questions, and but I guess what we have got today is enough food for another months of digestions in terms of both theory and methodology. So I'm also, from the side of the Tribal Intellectual Collective, extremely happy that many of our own friends from across the country have come and participated. I think it's an amazing thing for us to be able to get people from across the country, whether you are from the tribal community or you're not from the tribal community, people who have basically come to engage on very complex and very critical issues like the tribal reality today. So I want to say thank to them before I pass on to our member, Rocky, who will probably give the vote of thanks to Professor Kaka and for the wonderful lecture that we have today. So let me call Rocky and just let us hear Rocky. If you, Ashish, can unmute Rocky?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Rocky? Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone. In fact, this inaugural Tribal Intellectual Collective lecture could not have been possible had Professor Virginus Kaka not agreed to deliver it. In fact, we are really fortunate to have Professor Virginus Kaka, who himself is the founding member of TICI. And thank you so much, Professor Virginus Kaka, for the brilliant lecture and taking us through our 100 years in the emergence of the tribal studies and enlightening us with varied perspective. And most importantly, for bringing up and deepening perspective from within. So I also thank Ruby and Bodhi for brilliantly moderating these sessions. And I also thank all the participants, and I'm sure all of us will take home perspective and theoretical positions as posited by Professor Virginus Kaka. and further the tribal studies in years to come. This lecture, in fact, clearly delineates what the Tribal Intellectual Collective India poses as pre and post Khaka framework of tribal studies. And I'm very thankful Professor Khaka was with us today. And thank you all once again.
Okay, so we can close it for the day. Thank you.